You think you know what a peaceful country looks like. Maybe for you it's Tanzania. For years its name has meant calm headlines, safaris, white sand beaches, friendly people, a place others in East Africa pointed to as proof that stability was possible. A place where if you heard a loud bang at night, you assumed it was a car backfiring or a generator, not a gun. Now imagine this, a shaky video on your phone, a woman running down a dusty street, clutching something small in her hand, a crack of gunfire. The camera jolts. And then, in a voice so quiet it barely rises above the wind, someone behind the phone whispers, This is our Tanzania?" In a few seconds, the image in your head fractures. The country you thought you knew suddenly has a second face. Shot bodies on pavement, morgues so full the dead spill onto the floor. White pickup trucks moving at night without sirens, without markings, through neighborhoods where people start closing curtains a little earlier. For most of the world, Tanzania's darkest week passed as a brief headline, if it appeared at all. A contested election, some unrest, a government statement, and then the news cycle moved on. But for people inside the country, and for the families who still haven't found their missing loved ones, that week never really ended. So tonight, let's do what the official statements haven't. Let's slow down, rewind, and ask the question that has been haunting Tanzanians ever since those first videos spread. How does a country that prides itself on peace reach a breaking point so severe that it has to bury not just its dead, but some say the truth itself? To understand that, you have to start on a night that should have felt predictable. Election results night. In many parts of the world, that means celebration, or anger, or at least noise. Tanzania's election at the end of October was different in one important way. Few people were surprised by the outcome. In the months before the vote, the playing field had narrowed. Opposition figures found themselves disqualified, detained, or pushed off the ballot. The ruling party's machinery, from local branches to national media, left little room for uncertainty. By the time the Electoral Commission announced the result, giving the incumbent an overwhelming share of the vote, many Tanzanians had long suspected that the script had been written in advance. When the numbers came in, people stepped outside anyway. Not as a riot, not as a victory parade, but as something more fragile, gatherings of confusion. Small clusters of neighbors met at street corners, arms folded, speaking in low voices. They were not throwing stones. They were not breaking windows. They were trying to match the official story on TV with what they had seen and heard in the weeks before. The air wasn't chaotic. It was thick, like a room where somebody has just told a lie and everyone else is deciding whether to challenge it. Cars passed slowly. Shop owners leaned in their doorways. Young people scrolled through their phones looking for clues in chat groups and voice notes. The overwhelming feeling was not rage. It was disbelief. And then, without warning, the mood changed. Not with a siren, not with a loudspeaker telling people to go home, but with the flat, unmistakable sound of live ammunition. One shot, then another, then a rapid burst. It cut through the low murmur of conversation like a knife through cloth. People scattered. Some ducked behind walls and cars. Others froze for a heartbeat, as if they needed one more second to convince themselves that, yes, that really was gunfire. This was not a country at war. This was election week in a place that prided itself on being the calm neighbor. Hearing bullets in that context felt like hearing a scream in a library. Someone raised a phone, not to chase likes, but because instinct said, the world needs to see this. The shaky camera panned across a street. In the distance, you could make out a line of security forces, shapes in uniform, armed, moving forward in formation. No attempt at negotiation. No water cannons or tear gas warnings first, just shots. And behind that camera, you heard a sentence that captured more than any analysis could. "This is our Tanzania?" Not yelled, whispered like a prayer going wrong. It wasn't a question about politics. It was a question about identity, about waking up in a familiar house and realizing the foundation wasn't what you thought. If that had been the end, an isolated moment of panic, a few warning shots, it would still have been troubling. But the way the security forces moved that night made it clear this wasn't improvisation. There was nothing hesitant about their posture, nothing confused about their response. They behaved as if any gathering, no matter how quiet, was a threat to be crushed quickly, decisively, and if necessary, lethally. And while the streets were still echoing, another decision was made far from any camera. Internet service began to flicker and fail. Social media slowed, then stopped. News websites became difficult to open. In some areas, lights went out. A nationwide curfew was announced. For people trying to upload videos or call relatives, it felt as if someone had pulled a heavy curtain across the country. The first bullets were terrifying. But as the days unfolded, it wasn't just the sound of gunfire that kept people awake. It was something colder. The realization that what happened next seemed designed not only to break protest, but to erase proof. If you watch the videos closely, you start to see patterns. One clip shows a woman running down a road, clutching a small stick and a stone. Objects taken less as weapons than as instinctive attempts at protection, the way someone might reach for anything when they feel vulnerable. She is not charging at officers. She is not facing them at all. She is running away, shoulders hunched, the way anyone runs when they just want to get home. The camera tracks her for a few seconds and then, with no warning, she falls. Not in confusion, not in the stumbling way of someone who trips, but with the clean, brutal finality of a bullet strike. Her body hits the ground, limbs loose. The person filming gasps. In the background, you can almost hear the world tilt. Later, her family would tell journalists that she was 3 months pregnant. A mother of 2, she had not left home that day to fight. She had left across the street and then tried to escape when the situation turned violent. Audio specialists who examined the recording later calculated that the gunshot most likely came from roughly 100 meters away. At that distance, hitting a moving person isn't an accident. It is a deliberate act. You do not squeeze a trigger without thinking. You stabilize, you aim, you commit. Minutes after the woman fell, another video from the same area showed a young man in a red shirt. He too was some distance from the line of security forces. He was not holding a weapon when the bullet hit. One moment he was upright, the next his body crumpled, a dark pool spreading around his head on the asphalt. From another angle, analysis suggested that the shooter stood far enough away that claims of self-defense or split-second panic lose their meaning. These were not close-quarters clashes. They were distant shots at unarmed people who were running away. Other footage added more layers. In several neighborhoods, unmarked white pickup trucks appeared alongside police vehicles. Men in plain clothes, some carrying rifles, jumped out, moved through alleys and courtyards with a control that suggested training, not improvisation. Drones or rooftop cameras captured armed men, sweeping through residential blocks after protests had already been broken up on main roads. The message in all of this wasn't subtle. It wasn't disperse and go home. It was you have nowhere to hide. At the same time, phone lines crackled, then fell silent. People trying to share clips found their posts failing to upload. Some received text messages warning of severe punishment for spreading false information or inciting unrest. In a matter of hours, the country shifted from a tense election night to something else entirely, a controlled blackout with guns. For many Tanzanians, especially those who grew up believing that this kind of event only happened in other countries, the shock was personal. They had believed in a certain story about their homeland, calm, measured, different. Watching their own security forces fire at retreating civilians felt like watching a trusted parent raise a hand against a child. But the full weight of what had happened that week wouldn't hit until people started going to the hospitals and morgues. Not as observers, but as families. That's where the truth stopped being an argument and became something much harder to look away from. There is a shift in any crisis when rumors and statements fade into the background and physical reality takes over. In Tanzania's darkest week, that shift happened on cold metal tables. Doctors began to talk, not loudly, not on television, but in quiet conversations with journalists and human rights groups. One physician, exhausted, described what his hospital looked like in the days after the protests. The morgue, he said, reached capacity. When they ran out of space inside, bodies were laid outside on stretchers and then on the ground. There was nowhere else to put them. These weren't people who had died over weeks of illness or traffic accidents. The dead arriving in those days were mostly young, overwhelmingly male, with gunshot wounds to the head, chest, and abdomen, torn clothing, dried blood. Some had clearly lain where they fell for hours before being picked up and transported. Video from one large public hospital in Dar es Salaam showed corridors meant for patients now lined with bodies. In a mortuary room, corpses lay side by side on the floor, some overlapping, without sheets or name tags. It was the kind of scene you associate with war zones or natural disasters, not with a country that was telling the world it had experienced only limited incidents. The Ministry of Health dismissed the footage as fake. For a moment, that denial created confusion. In any heated political moment, there are indeed false images, old clips repurposed in staged scenes. Skepticism is healthy. But then families started speaking up. A woman watching one of the videos online recognized the shirt of her brother. Another relative identified a pair of shoes, a watch, a familiar face. They had spent days searching every official list and facility, hearing the same phrases. "No, we have no record," or "We cannot allow you in." Then they saw their loved ones on the floor of a mortuary the government had told them contained no such bodies. Human rights organizations began to compile testimonies. The same pattern came up again and again. A son or brother went out during the protests and never came home. Witnesses saw him shot or saw him carried away by police or men with guns. The family checked hospitals, police stations, morgues. They found nothing. No body, no file, no explanation. Just a kind of bureaucratic void. Meanwhile, doctors and nurses whispered estimates that went far beyond any official suggestion. Dozens sounded too small. Hundreds sounded closer to reality. Some believed the number of people killed or seriously injured ran far higher than what anyone in power was willing to admit. But no comprehensive list was ever published. No transparent investigation released a tally. The dead became numbers debated on television rather than individuals acknowledged by name. For the families, that added a cruel extra layer to their grief. It is one thing to lose someone. It is another to be told, in effect, that their death does not officially exist. Outside Tanzania, only fragments of this reality reached the news. A headline here about clashes. A clip there used as B-roll. Then something else grabbed the world's attention. But inside the country, as people walked past overfilled hospitals and heard whispers about missing relatives, a deeper, more frightening question began to take shape. If the morgues were full, but many families still couldn't find their dead, then some asked, where were those other bodies going? In every national tragedy, there is a point where suspicion stops being a rumor and starts to feel like a map. In Tanzania, that pivot came when the stories of missing people intersected with sightings of those quiet white trucks. Residents in several neighborhoods began talking about them in cautious tones. No license plates easily visible, no flashing lights. They moved at odd hours, often after midnight, turning down side roads that regular traffic avoided. Neighbors described men jumping out in plain clothes, some carrying rifles, some wearing gloves. They moved with purpose, not haste, like people following orders, not panicking. From above, drone footage later showed armed men walking alongside uniformed police, sweeping through residential blocks where protests had already been dispersed. That cooperation mattered. It suggested this was not a rogue unit, not a band of unofficial enforcers, but a coordinated operation. At the same time, stories began to circulate about a particular burial ground on the outskirts of Dar es Salaam, a cemetery called Kondo, near the coastal suburb of Kunduchi. At first, it was just a place mentioned in passing by people who lived nearby. They spoke of nights when trucks arrived unexpectedly, of the sound of shovels in the dark, of voices carrying across the open land. Satellite images would later add weight to those whispers. Photos taken before the election showed a stretch of sandy ground at the edge of the cemetery, mostly undisturbed. Images from the days after the crackdown revealed something very different. Large patches of freshly turned earth in neat rectangular clusters, in an area where there had been no public record of new burials. The soil looked uneven, unsettled, as if a great deal had been done in a very short time. On the ground, amateur videos filmed by locals added detail. The camera moved over ridges and mounds of pale sand, some still soft, with fragments of fabric and exposed roots visible in the disturbed soil. There were no headstones, no flowers, no names, just raw earth. Witnesses who spoke with investigators described trucks arriving late at night. They talked about seeing small groups of men working quickly under dim lights, then leaving before dawn. No announcements were made, no families invited, no religious ceremonies held in the open. At this point, the question for many Tanzanians was no longer, did something bad happen? That had been answered on the streets and in the hospitals. The question was now sharper, more devastating. Were some of their dead being hidden? The government's response was silence. No explanation for the earth at Kondo. No detailed accounting of the missing. No public acknowledgement of the white trucks or the nighttime digging. Officials referred to isolated incidents, to regrettable events, and then pivoted to messages about stability, unity, and moving on. But the people who lived near that cemetery, and the families still searching for their sons and brothers, could not simply move on. For them, the ground itself had become a kind of evidence, and that made the silence from above feel less like caution and more like denial. If morgues were overflowing, if trucks were moving at night, and if fresh soil was appearing in unmarked corners of burial grounds, then the question weighing on the nation was no longer abstract. It was terrifyingly concrete. What exactly had been buried during Tanzania's darkest week, and how many people were beneath that newly turned earth? To piece together that answer, different kinds of investigations started to converge. Local activists gathered testimonies. International newsrooms sent forensic teams. Human rights organizations mapped the timelines. Analysts compared satellite images from late October and early November, highlighting changes in the Kondo cemetery. They traced vehicle tracks, studied shadows, and matched them against accounts from residents who said they had seen trucks arrive on specific nights. This wasn't Hollywood, it was painstaking, sometimes dull work. But it built a pattern. On-the-ground footage, verified by geolocation techniques, placed security forces, plainclothes gunmen, and white pickup trucks in the same neighborhoods at the same hours. In some videos, you could hear voices calling out names as people were pushed into vehicles. In others, you saw only the aftermath, blood on pavement, discarded shoes, and the distant sound of engines pulling away. Human rights groups compiled lists of those reported missing. The numbers grew. A father whose son had joined a peaceful march, never seen again. A delivery driver caught between his work route and a protest line. A young man who had gone out simply to film events on his phone. Opposition leaders, church officials, and civil society figures began to speak of hundreds killed, possibly more. Some claim the toll might exceed 1,000, drawing on unofficial counts from hospitals, morgues, and communities. They argued that the combination of live ammunition, sealed-off neighborhoods, and nighttime operations made a much larger number of victims not just possible, but likely. International bodies took notice. The United Nations Human Rights Office expressed deep concern, citing credible reports that hundreds may have been killed or injured. Major human rights organizations condemned the use of lethal force against unarmed protesters and the blackout of communications that made independent verification so difficult. Foreign governments, some with close ties to Tanzania, issued carefully worded statements urging transparency, restraint, and real investigations. Inside Tanzania, the government's narrative was starkly different. Officials initially denied that anyone had been killed in connection with the protests. As images and testimonies piled up, the tone shifted slightly. A few deaths were acknowledged in vague terms, but no comprehensive list was released. No senior commanders stepped forward to accept responsibility. No clear explanation was offered for why live bullets had been used so quickly and so widely. At one point, a commission of inquiry was announced. On paper, that sounded like progress. But almost immediately, criticism arose. Members of the commission were seen as too close to the authorities. The terms of reference seemed narrow. Public statements hinted that the investigation might focus as much on whether protesters had been paid as on why so many of them had been shot. For families waiting for answers, this did not feel like justice. It felt like a familiar script. Create a committee, buy time, diffuse outrage, and hope the world's attention shifts elsewhere. Supporters of the government had their own narrative. They pointed to property damage, to images of people throwing stones, to reports of clashes in which officers were injured. In their telling, the state had acted to preserve order against dangerous unrest. They accused foreign media of exaggeration and bias, of seeking to tarnish Tanzania's image. They suggested that some of the videos might have been staged or taken out of context. The truth, as always, was messier than either extreme. It is possible that some protests turned violent, that some individuals did throw stones or damage property. But the specific evidence we have, the long-distance shots at retreating civilians, the overfull morgues, the missing bodies, the fresh earth, points to something far beyond crowd control. It points to a government that, for at least 1 week, treated its own citizens not as people to be protected, but as problems to be eliminated and, in some cases, erased. That conclusion is not just about bullets and trenches. It is about what happened next, or rather, what didn't. No public list of the dead, no full accounting of the missing, no televised hearings where grieving parents could face those who ordered the crackdown, no national day of mourning. Instead, life staggered forward under a heavy, unspoken weight. Markets reopened, schools resumed, politicians returned to talking points about development and progress. But in homes across the country, an invisible line had been crossed. The young generation, the ones who recorded, uploaded, and shared videos despite the risks, now carry a version of Tanzanian history that cannot easily be folded back into the official narrative. They have seen their government deny things their own eyes have witnessed. They have watched the gap widen between statements and reality. That knowledge won't simply disappear with time. It will shape how they vote, how they trust, and how they teach their children what peaceful country really means. For decades, Tanzania's identity has rested on a simple, powerful story. We are the calm one. In a region scarred by coups, invasions, and civil wars, Tanzania has been the slow, steady neighbor. Its founding father preached unity over division. Its politics, though imperfect, often looked less volatile than those next door. That story wasn't just state propaganda. Ordinary Tanzanians believed it, and with good reason. For many years, they experienced fewer explosive crises than some of their neighbors. They were proud of that difference. They carried it almost like a passport. "We are Tanzanian," they could say. "We don't do that here." Then came the darkest week. Unarmed civilians shot from a distance, hospitals overflowing with bodies, families searching for loved ones who had vanished into a maze of official denials. Satellite images of disturbed earth in unmarked corners of cemeteries. Each new piece of evidence didn't just challenge a government, it challenged an identity. If this could happen in Tanzania, then what did peaceful really mean? Was it a true reflection of the country's soul, or just a lack of documentation in earlier times? Was the nation changing, or was it revealing something that had always been there? Hidden beneath politeness and slogans? For young people, the shock was particularly sharp. They were born after earlier eras of repression. They came of age in a world of smartphones and social media, where images from other countries, police shootings, protests, crackdowns, arrived on their screens daily. Many of them took comfort in the belief that such scenes belonged to elsewhere. Now they were watching similar scenes unfold in their own streets, and when they raised their phones to document what they saw, they encountered not only bullets and batons, but digital erasure. Posts removed, accounts restricted, a state machine trying to push their testimony into the shadows. For elders, the pain was different, but no less deep. They remembered years of relative calm and took pride in the idea that Tanzania had avoided the worst kinds of violence. Seeing the country's own institutions turn inward against its children felt like betrayal of past sacrifices, of hard-won unity, of the moral lessons they thought had been passed down. Trust, once broken in this way, does not return on command. It cannot be restored by a speech or a committee or a few arrests of low-level officers. It is earned slowly through transparency, through credible investigations, through genuine accountability. None of those things have fully appeared yet. Instead, Tanzanians are living in a kind of emotional fog. They go to work, they pay their bills, they attend weddings and funerals. But beneath these routines lies a shared, unspoken awareness. Something fundamental has changed between the governed and those who govern. And that raises three questions that go far beyond Tanzania. The first is about the country itself. Can a nation heal from wounds it refuses to name? You can plaster over a crack in a wall and paint it the same color as before. From a distance, the house may look intact, but anyone who lives inside will notice how the crack still affects everything. Doors that don't close right, floors that aren't level, sounds that travel strangely at night. Without fixing the structure, the cosmetic repairs don't mean much. The second question is regional. Tanzania was supposed to be the example that stability was possible without massive repression. If even this country can slip into live fire crackdowns, internet blackouts, and alleged mass graves during an election dispute, what does that say about the health of democracy in the region? What message does it send to other governments tempted to trade legitimacy for control? The third question is global. For most people outside Africa, this entire story barely registered. While Tanzanians watched their screens in horror, many international viewers saw nothing at all. A few courageous journalists and investigators pushed the evidence forward, but the story did not dominate front pages or evening broadcasts. If media attention flickers in and out, if diplomatic statements stay vague, if economic interests trump human rights, then a dangerous precedent is set that a government can shut down the internet, fire on its people, quietly bury the evidence, and still be treated as a respectable partner. So where does that leave ordinary Tanzanians, especially the young ones who filmed, uploaded, and refused to forget? They find themselves in a complicated position. They still love their country. They still speak Swahili with pride, celebrate their music, their food, their landscapes. But their relationship with the state has changed. It is more cautious, less trusting, more conditional. They know now that loyalty cannot be one way. A government that asks for obedience but refuses to acknowledge the pain it has caused is asking for something it has not earned. For Tanzania, the road ahead will be defined less by what happened in that darkest week, terrible as it was, than by what happens next. Will there be an honest reckoning, driven not only from the top down but from the bottom up? Will there be memorials, truth-telling, reforms to ensure that such a week cannot repeat? Or will the country try to bury this chapter under layers of silence, hoping that time and distraction will do what justice did not? Those choices will shape more than politics. They will shape the emotional fabric of the nation. Children will grow up hearing either that their country faced its worst moment with courage and honesty, or that it looked away and pretended nothing happened. One of those stories leads to deeper citizenship. The other leads to cynicism. If you have watched this far, you probably feel some of that weight, even from a distance. Maybe you remember moments in your own country's history. Civil rights marches beaten back by police, protests met with tear gas and bullets, acts of violence that were denied before they were finally acknowledged. You know how long it takes for a nation to confront its own reflection? The details are different in Tanzania, the language is different, the uniforms are different, but the underlying struggle is painfully familiar. Between truth and denial, between power and accountability, between a comforting myth of who we are and the reality of what has been done in our name. So perhaps the most important question to leave you with is not only about Tanzania, but about us, watching from afar. If we believe that African lives matter as much as any others, if we believe that African stories deserve more than a few seconds of footage before the next headline, then how do we respond when a peaceful country walks into its darkest week and tries to switch off the lights? If you believe those stories shouldn't vanish into unmarked ground, stay with us. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who still thinks Tanzania is only beaches and safaris. There will be more investigations, more histories, more voices that mainstream cameras overlook. Because when citizens risk everything to record the truth, when families search for loved ones the state refuses to name, when a generation quietly says, "We saw what happened and we will not forget," one thing becomes clear. No matter how tightly power tries to control the narrative, Africa bows to no one.